Well, during the week, Stats SA announced that the economy declined 3.2% in the first quarter of the year. Economists have described it as the biggest quarterly contraction in 10 years. But what can be done to reverse this, especially as the ANC quarrel about the South African Reserve Bank, and it actually continues quarreling about that? We've got Marius Oosthuizen, who is a business expert, and he joins us now to actually unpack this conversation. Marius, thanks a lot for joining us on Newsnight. It is projected that the economy, I mean, we're currently looking at about 0.8%, but the economy should be growing probably about 1.1% if we're being optimistic, 1.5%. Some economists have actually come out to say, again, if we're being optimistic. But what are we going to do to reverse this issue around the economy?
Well, I think, Faith, the reality is we're at the end of a 10-year period of stagnation. On the back of policy uncertainty, mismanagement of the economy, we're now seeing the remnants of that in the lack of economic growth. I think we're going to continue to see that lack of growth unless we have rapid investment in the economy. And as you know, investors will look at business confidence, they'll look at stability in policy, and of course the debate around the SARB at the moment is not helpful to that.
Of course, I mean, the debate around the SARB issue, it almost appears to be a political one. That is now political rhetoric as well as populist beliefs are now being, propagated into the media. We pick it up, and then obviously, a business picks it up, and then there is that policy uncertainty. To what extent does the policy uncertainty play when it comes to, the fluctuation of the economy?
We have to appreciate that South Africa is really at its heart a free market capitalist economy. Even though we have a government and an ANC party that thinks of the state as what they call a capable and developmental state, the reality is the largest part of the GDP is created by the private sector. Now, what that means is that private sector investors from South Africa and abroad will look at the economy, they'll look at the prospects for growth, they'll think about risk, and they'll think about certainty. And so in an environment where we have a lack of policy certainty around land expropriation without compensation, around things like the mandate of the Reserve Bank, investors will hold off investment, and without investment you don't have growth, without growth you don't have jobs. And with a country with a youth unemployment sitting at above 50% for under 35-year-olds, we really desperately need that growth in those jobs. Of course, the ANC would like to create those jobs. It thinks of itself in government as a developmental state, and to do that it wants to drive investment, probably public sector investment, but with our debt levels at 57%, that's half of GDP, the public sector doesn't have the money to invest. It has to have the private sector invest, and the policy uncertainty prevents that from happening.
Well, the public sector at this moment in time, from a governance and management perspective, one may say that is a little bit in crisis. If you see the resignation, well, now we've got SAA, which has just acquired a new CEO, but we had the resignation of Vuyani Jagana from SAA, and then Eskom as well, and they were about 10 days apart. So it says something about our parastatals in this country and the effectiveness of our parastatals, or should we be looking rather at how to more privatize certain SOEs in this country?
If you look at South Africa's economic history, you'll notice that the SOEs played a critical role in the industrialization of the economy. So Eskom for energy, Transnet for logistics, even Telkom for telecommunications, Iscor at the time for steel. And so we have to appreciate that at the core of our industrial economy are the SOEs. What we've seen in the last few years is a fundamental mismanagement of those SOEs, using them for crony capitalism, corruption, jobs for pals. And what that's done in the process is it's pushed up the cost of electricity while pushing down the quality of the delivery of those services. Now, if you're in business, if you're in manufacturing with a factory somewhere in South Africa, and you're paying 50% more for electricity, that's 50% off your profit margin. And so what government has to do, while it tries to run these SOEs effectively, it has to improve the efficiency of the SOEs. I think some SOEs like SAA have run out of room, have run out of runway, to use a pun. I think SAA needs to be privatized. With Eskom, I think with the unbundling is a start, but I think fundamentally we have to rethink the SOEs. We're in a world now where we're no longer in a fossil fuel energy world, we're in a renewable energy world. And so the government of the day has to think about how do we repurpose our SOEs for an economy that's competitive in the fourth industrial revolution.
Oh, goodness, I can feel unions already going up in arms around this conversation, because there is this conception that, if we go into the issues around renewable energy, number one, it's going to be expensive. Number two, it's going to benefit the few capitalists that are actually in charge of it because of the nature and the structure of certain deals. But number three, that the trade unionists and the people on the ground are going to lose out on it, because a lot of them, let's be honest, a lot of the people on the ground rely on certain jobs. For example, in the mining sector, for example, in Eskom, you're talking about Transnet, for example, the lower level jobs, significant portion of them, our communities rely on them. What are they going to do now? It's an issue around the fourth industrial revolution, meaning upscaling and upskilling people, and can we afford to upskill people so we can align?
I think there's a difference between narrow vested interests and the national interest.
Yeah.
You know, in a country with 11 million South Africans of working age unemployed, the vested interest of private capital, of politicians, and of those in unions that represent a small working minority is not the most important conversation in the country. Of course, we have to think about their interests. Many people working in the mining sector, for instance, will have to be reskilled. But the other side of the coin is that the fourth industrial revolution, if we have a revolution in manufacturing, for instance, using technology, will create millions of other jobs that we don't currently have. And so it's not only a case of looking after the interests of that small group, it's also a case of creating the jobs for the youth that are the future of this country. If we don't create those jobs, the populism that they will produce will bring down the entire system. We have a window of opportunity to create those jobs.
But shouldn't the country then be looking at diversifying the economy? Let's take a China, for example. China had to move from a manufacturing perspective into a more consumer-based perspective in order for them to actually gather the economic growth that they're supposed to. So as South Africa, we've been relying heavily in terms of the mining sector and exporting our raw materials and exporting our minerals. Should we not be looking at how do we diversify this economy? And if we're going to be looking at diversifying the economy, what is the right strategy to adopt?
I think you're asking exactly the right question. You know, South Africa has moved past a minerals-based primary sector economy. Yeah. We are fairly diversified. The difficulty is that we import the products that are the most value added. And the consequence of that is that we're paying Chinese people for their products, or Americans for their products, or Europeans for their products like iPhones and Huawei phones. And the value that's produced in that process doesn't accrue to us. And so South Africa has to take a view that says, how can we be competitive in the manufacture of some of those products ourselves, not only in South Africa, but how can we position ourselves to manufacture things that the rest of Africa wants? You know, Africa has today just under 1 billion people. By 2050, that'll be 2.5 billion consumers. And South Africa needs to think about how do we service the markets in those countries, and what are the factors of competitiveness that will make South African companies able to do that better than Chinese or American or European companies.
We're talking now about jobs of the future and also being able to align the economy to the needs of the future. What are some of those top ones? I know you've got them in terms of exactly where should we be looking at as a South African economy in terms of manufacturing and being able to service the rest of the continent and being really competitive, because I truly believe for us to sit down and have a conversation about skill or brain drain sort of says something about, it says that we do not have enough capacity and brain capacity to actually produce, which I don't think it's true. I think we do have enough brain capacity, but what should we be manufacturing and producing that will make us and give us that competitive advantage?
You know, South Africa was the first country to do a heart transplant. It was the first country to develop helicopter technology that can be used in the desert in the Middle East. We have a history in South Africa of innovating, and we have to do it again. We have to find ways to innovate. We have to look at value chains in things like agro-processing, where currently we just export our best fruit and vegetables. We have to do agro-processing. We've got to think about things like additive manufacturing and 3D printing. We've got to think about things like aerospace, where we already do motor vehicle manufacturing. We should be producing the drones that do the precision agriculture in the continent of Africa. All the technologies and skills to do that are in the country.
So then why aren't we doing it? Do we lack the political will? Do we lack the manufacturing will? What is it that makes us not want to be innovative and actually start exporting some of those products as you're mentioning?
I think South Africa is a bit like an orchestra without a conductor. We have the political elite pulling in one direction, the business elite in another, the labor in another. We have the communities uncertain about what the future is. What we need to do is come together as a country, articulate a national vision, coordinate our efforts, and make a decision of where we want to go. And that will produce the policy certainty, which will produce the certainty in the business confidence, which will produce the investment, which will get us to those jobs.
One would say that, you know, when President Ramaphosa was actually doing his runs and up to the elections, it was a lot of appeasing the business community about what is to come. And many individuals are saying that there was a lot of Ramaphoria in the country at the time. It appears as though Ramaphoria is dwindling slightly, especially where business is concerned.
I think we have to turn the Ramaphoria into Ramafacts. We have to start making decisions and implementing policies that are good for the country. Of course, we understand the president has to manage the political environment, which is fraught with all kinds of difficulties around factionalism and vested interest around corrupt cadres, for instance. But I think the time has come, if we look at the lack of growth in the economy, we look at the debt levels in the country, the time has come for the president to be the president, to take executive leadership. I think business will respond positively. I think society, communities will respond positively. And at the end of the day, I think the future of the ANC as a party depends on the president showing leadership.
Yeah, I mean, on the other side of it is this issue around our trade deficit. In fact, earlier this week, it was speaking about how South Africa is actually known to import more than it does actually export. So our trade deficit has actually increased. And just this week, it was a leading story that we were running with. And that says something. Again, why is it that we're importing more than we're exporting? Why is it that we keep exasperating our trade deficit? Is there issue around our capability to manufacture finished products and actually start with the exporting, especially to the continent? Because I truly believe that we've got some top-end and top-notch technology here.
You know, if you look at the numbers, as I said, 11 million unemployed of working age, 17 million on social grants. The consequence of that is that half the population are only on the consumption side of the economy. They're not on the productive side. And so the reality is that unless South Africa has the investment, which means that we localize production in the products and services we consume, we'll continue to weaken the currency, we'll continue to become poorer as South Africans. As I've said, we've done it before. We manufacture automobiles in South Africa. We manufacture some of the best technologies in the world in health.
Came as a result of a crisis because we were an isolated and a sanctioned state, so we had to manufacture and get our own fuel.
So if you think about the SOEs that were created in the second and third industrial revolution around mechanization and computers, we're now in the fourth industrial revolution. What will South Africa create and what will we sell the rest of the world given those technologies? How will we use our human capital and ingenuity to create that value? That's what we should be focused on.
Marius, I don't know how I feel after this conversation, but it is definitely enlightening, and I think that it's something that all South Africans need to start thinking about in terms of how do we change the narrative of the country and maybe stop being victims and start being victors in terms of our approach to the economy. We're going to leave our conversation there, but thanks for joining us on Newsnight, shedding some light there in terms of what must be done to salvage our economy. I mean, growth rates have been forecast, and also it appears as though our trade deficit is increasing as time progresses.